Ultimately, we can avoid all of this, and I'd love to avoid all of this, if we just put more effort into addressing the underlying racial disparities in this country. But nobody wants to do that.
Which would be what
real anti-redlining policies and reparations, not on race, it gets messy, but on class.
Not on race, it gets messy, but on class.
Because if you were poor 100 years ago and white, you had it better than if you're poor 100 years ago and black, for sure. But there are still issues you can fix across the board.
100 years ago, the American government was still denying former slaves 40 acres and a mule. But it did have the Homestead Act in effect, which largely excluded black people who descend from American chattel slavery. What's interesting about this conversation is that these two people are supposed to be from two opposite sides of the political spectrum, and yet they are so easily in agreement with leaving the racial hierarchy as is. In their minds, black people should not exceed the very bottom of white society. Even though the reason why reparations are to be paid is because of injuries that we receive from the American government that these other groups of poor people have not received.
And that way you
don't get a lot of really messy racial politics that might otherwise involve, like, what do? Like, you test people's blood.
A goal that is associated with the redress component of reparations is to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And this would be done primarily through direct payments to eligible recipients, Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. In the book, we identify two standards for eligibility. The first criteria is what we refer to as a lineage criteria. An eligible individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And the second criterion is what we refer to as an identity criterion. And this is a criterion that says that an individual would have to show that for at least 12 years before the onset of a reparations program, the enactment of a reparations program, or the enactment of a study commission for a reparations program, whichever comes first, for at least 12 years before that, an individual would have to have shown that they self-identified as Black, Negro, or African American.
Like, what do? Like, you test people's blood, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
I agree with that for sure.
Yeah, that gets really, really messy. But nobody wants to do this. I mean, Republicans, Democrats, neither of them want to do this.
But nobody wants to do this. Democrats, neither of them want to do this.
I know, and this is contended in a lot of conservative circles, but I think an economist recently estimated that the damage done to the black community in this country could be monetarily represented by a figure of like
14 trillion.
And that's one estimate, of course.
But it's just political. I mean, how do you actually estimate this stuff?
Of course, you know, there are different methods and methodologies. I'm not an economist. I can't fact check him. I know there are lower estimates as well. But we know this, you know. In the United States of America, for the longest time, the western reaches of this country, they didn't have roads, and they didn't have electricity, and they didn't have phone lines. And through an enormous expenditure of federal wealth, we put effort into bringing that infrastructure westward, because the investment brings about more educated people, encourages the development of more land, which allows for more people to live there, which means more money. And we're facing now the same issue, albeit in a much more sophisticated way, with a lot of poor communities in this country, a lot of which are Black or Latino, where we now know these communities are black holes of wealth. People will make fun of this. Like, why give money to the schools? It's a black hole. We could invest. We could prevent that from being a problem.
But there are more poor white people than poor black people.
Sure, and we should invest, absolutely. But there are specific elements of
black poverty.
To be fair, I think you already said
reparations on class,
not race anyway.
Yeah,
I get it.
There are.
And there's a disproportion of people of one race who might be wealthier or
he's being held hostage by Tim in his basement.
If you enact racial policy, you leave people poor and you don't actually solve the problem of poverty. So is our goal to just say we want to help one race, ignoring all the others, or do we want to end poverty? In which case, these programs should be ended and our policies should be based on class and not race, so long as we've gotten rid of racism in our laws.
Sure, the racial, of course. Well, there are racial disparities that'll need to be addressed as well. If you have black folk on average in a certain place and white folk on average in a better place, lifting people out of poverty won't fix the respective divide between black and white people. It'll just level the pot in general.
If you have black folk on average in a certain place and white folk on average in a better place, lifting people out of poverty won't fix the respective divide between black and white people. It'll just level the pot in general.
So here we have a white leftist socialist explaining to this guy who is a cheerleader for the alt-right how the left plans to screw the American descendants of slavery out of reparations. The alt-right motherfucker is receptive to this idea because he understands that this will not change the racial hierarchy in America. The white leftist admits the con game of using the term reparations to screw black people, and they find common ground on the idea of black people remaining at the bottom of this society. And you still believe these are your fucking allies?
By 1968, you can't say nigga, that hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.